Hello, I'm Natural Virgo, and I decided to do some videos on different crime stories that has happened, and you may have heard of it in passing, but I'm here to give you a little more detail, and it's my passion because I love watching ID, Snap, reading crime novels and things like that. So I just want to kind of share some stories that I think maybe you don't hear a lot of, but they're nonetheless still interesting. And this one is about Frank Matthews, also known as Black Caesar. He was born in Durham, North Carolina on February 13th, 1944. His mother died when he was about 4. He was raised by his aunt. Now, he did have a few brushes with the law as a juvenile. I think he probably was honing in on his craft during the Jim Crow era. And eventually he did serve time in juvenile detention. Now, eventually, Frank had bigger aspirations than staying in North Carolina. So he moved to Philly, where he began running numbers. But eventually, he still felt that he wanted to move on to bigger and greater things. So he eventually relocated to Brooklyn, New York. He did run numbers there at a local barbershop, but he saw that the drug trade, there was greater revenue to be made. What he made in a year, he can make that in a couple of weeks. So with the death of Bumpy Johnson in 1968, it kind of opened up the field for up-and-coming independent drug dealers to kind of take over and mark their territory, so to speak. But you have to keep in mind also during that time that all drug dealers still had to go through the mafia, who ultimately kept a stranglehold on the illegal drug trade in New York. Knowing this, Frank requested to sit down with 2 of the New York mob families, the Bananos and Gambinos, but they refused to even meet with him. That slight, Frank would never forget. But, not to be deterred, he eventually was introduced to a Cuban named Roland Gonzalez. He was one of New York's drug dealers. And once they forged this partnership, Frank could take his business to another level and become, a formidable drug dealer in New York. But however, the feds were already on to Gonzalez, and they was ready to indict. And he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in prison, so he fled to Venezuela to avoid charges. But he didn't let his fugitive status affect his drug business, because he still supplied Matthews with heroin and cocaine from Latin America and from their French connection. So in less than a year, Matthews, he had become one of New York's biggest drug dealers. That, coupled with his product, was just better than the mafia's. The mafias usually cut and sold a lower quality product. Matthews' product was just better. He had 2 drug mills, each in Brooklyn, where he had about 40 workers who were bussed in for 8 hours a day, paid about $100. They kind of worked in the drug mill with the mask, and they had armed guards guarding the door. If you ever saw the movie New Jack City, I would say that would be the Carter buildings. That was the inspiration behind that movie, what Frank Matthews had. By the early 70s, however, though, so in a few short years, his drug empire stretched to 21 states. He usually only worked with Black and Hispanic underbosses, and I think that was the sting he felt from the mafia families. He made about $250,000 per cash deal, and he was moving about 100 to 150 kilos of heroin into New York. His nickname Black Caesar was because his wardrobe consisted of sable, minks, leather suits. He always had a bevy of beautiful women. He traveled to Vegas, Super Bowl, and boxing events, and he can be seen at clubs, front row for entertainers like at his time, like Sammy Davis Jr. or Duke Ellington. He moved his common law wife and kids to a Staten Island estate. It was worth about $200,000. So even though he knew money wasn't an object at that time, I think Frank knew that this couldn't go on forever, and he planned for that. when that day would come. Um, but at that time, the law enforcement hadn't even heard of him. He wasn't even on their radar. They first were tipped off by a local detective that lived near one of his Brooklyn residents. And he noticed that there were luxury cars pulling up visiting Frank, leaving out with brown paper bags, various hours of the day and night. So he decided to run, this detective, he decided to run plate checks on these vehicles. Well, once he ran the plate checks, he found out that they were known drug dealers. So that began the investigation into Frank. But this detective, he worked on the case, would tell Frank, but once they found out how big Frank was, he eventually kicked it up. But at the time, Frank had no idea what was going on. So he went about his business. He even had a summit in Atlanta with major African American and Hispanic drug dealers, where they discussed ideas as such as becoming more vertically integrated and trying to cut out the mafia so they can gain more of control over the drug business. And that summit, nothing like that had taken place since the Lucky Luciano and Mayor Lansky days. But he even had two companies where they bought real estate in New York and down south. But eventually investigators were able to obtain a wiretap to his Flatbush, Brooklyn apartment, and they were astonished to learn that his business did span 21 states, and the IRS calculated that he owed $7 million in 1 year alone. So they were pretty close to closing in on Frank. His career ended. He was in Vegas gambling with his then girlfriend Cheryl Brown. They arrested him at McCarran Airport. And he was charged with tax evasion and conspiracy to distribute heroin and cocaine. And he was facing life behind bars. At that time, Frank was putting into motion, in the back of his mind, his ultimate escape plan. A Las Vegas judge set his bond at $5 million. But when he returned home back to New York, a judge reduced his bill to $325,000. Pretty low for a drug dealer with access to money. But Frank saw an opportunity and he posted bail. His family members put up different businesses and he posted bail, and he was released that day. He also had a weekly check-in requirement, which he adhered to up until June 26th in 1973. He took his girlfriend, left behind his wife and sons, and he was never heard from again. Now, he did tie up loose ends because authorities think he made a left with $20 million in cash. But he did reimburse the bail bondsman the $325,000 in bail. So his family's members who put up their assets, they wouldn't be their businesses wouldn't be taken from them. But the last time he was seen, he was 29 years old. They know he hid cash outside of the U.S., so maybe in the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands, but there hasn't been not one single sighting of Frank Matthews. I'm guessing he more than likely left the U.S. And he just vanished into thin air. I always thought it was an interesting story because usually drug dealers are eventually incarcerated or murdered, but he was able to do so much at a young age and vanish without. The authorities have not even heard anything from him, and I just think that's just astonishing. I often think what he could have done if he had used his business savvy for legitimate reasons, but that's neither here nor there. So thank you for allowing me to tell this story. I'm going to do some more stories as well. Not sure what I'm going to do next, but I want to do this on a weekly basis. So join me next time. Bye.